So welcome once again to the Center for Southeast European Studies panel on COVID-19 in the Balkans. I am Eric Gordy. I will be moderating, and we have our two presenters, Adnan Ćerimagić and Chelsi Ohueri. And without going into detailed introductions, I will immediately call upon our first presenter to begin presenting to us, and that is Adnan Ćerimagić. So Adnan, thanks for coming, and the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for having me, and good evening or good afternoon or good morning from Berlin. Eric asked me to provide a bit of an overview of what has been happening in the Western Balkans, in the 6 Western Balkan countries, when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic. And some of my thoughts that I would like in the next 7 to 10 minutes to organize in a system, like providing you first a figure and giving you a bit figure on the health part of the crisis with the COVID-19. And I will do that by giving you a context or providing you, basically one can start from looking just at the Western Balkans, but I think it's always very good to put them in the context of a wider region or in the context of the EU. So you will see figures for the Western Balkans compared compared with the figures in the EU. And I will try to provide you a bit of a context of what happened with the health systems in the region, what were the initial, what were the, let's say, medium term, and what are the challenges ahead. Then I would like to talk a little bit on trends, something that we had previously before and regardless of the COVID, when it comes to both the reforms, rule of law, democracy and economy in the region. And then after I finish with those trends and what happened with them during the pandemic, I would also like to discuss opportunities that are ahead of us and the opportunities that pandemic and what happened during it present for the Western Balkans. That being focused on the Western Balkans, putting it in the context of the EU also means that I will be very often saying things that there are exceptions in the case of particular countries. So if you want to raise particular issues for single countries to discuss why there it's a bit different or why it is not different, I'm happy to do that in the questions and answers section. So I will now share the screen with you, and I will basically start with today's figures. It's on 14, so basically in past 14 days, number of new COVID-19 cases per 100,000 population in the Western Balkans and 27 EU member states. What you can see from these figures is, let's start with the green, EU 27 average and the Western Balkans average. It seems that they are quite close, or EU 27 has a bit of a higher number when it comes to the number of new registered cases. You can also see that both Montenegro and Albania are outliers in the case of the Western Balkans, Albania in positive term and Montenegro in negative term. This shows, for example, probably that putting Western Balkans as a special case or seeing Western Balkans as significantly worse when it comes to at least to the figures than the EU would not necessarily stand the figures or statistics available. The second table that I would like to show you is the same 14 days cumulative number of COVID-19 deaths per 100,000 people. And there as well, you can see that the Western Balkans, again, let's focus on the green, Western Balkans and the EU 27 average are almost the same. Again, there we have outliers, but here we have Bosnia, Herzegovina, North Macedonia, and Montenegro that are among top 6 if we take all the countries together. And the last table with the figures that I would like to show you is the number of basically cases, deaths, and tests since the start of the pandemic. That means the total number for the Western Balkans, Romania, and the Netherlands. I picked up these 3 because Western Balkans, Romania, and Netherlands have a comparable size of population. Their first registered case was almost on the same day, with 1 or 2 days differences. So let's say the region, Western Balkan region, and Romania and Netherlands have been fighting with the pandemic for the same period of time. And what you can see is that the numbers for the Western Balkans, both on number of deaths and number of registered cases, is lower than Romania and Netherlands, but also the number of tests is higher in Romania and Netherlands, and for some 30%. But my point would be with all these tables is that when it comes to the figures and the statistics, it seems that the Western Balkans did not do significantly, is not going through this crisis significantly worse than let's say than the EU average, or than what some of the comparable sized countries or areas could be going. What we have seen, however, in the Western Balkans are a lot of reports, in particular from some areas of the region, such as Pristina, such as Novi Pazar in Serbia, or in Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which were showing that the health systems were struggling to react to outbreaks, to react to significant influx. But compared to, let's say, images that we were receiving from northern Italy, that we were receiving from Spain at some point, in France, except for notable exceptions, so far the health systems seem to have reacted, let's say, in at least on an average level, not significantly worse level than let's say the EU. And reasons for that are different from the fact that the Western Balkans have not been initially that much linked with the areas that had significant outbreaks of the virus, that they have closed themselves in March, April, that they have kind of shelled themselves from this initial wave, when understanding of the virus, when treatment of the patients of the virus was let's say, was still a big unknown. During the pandemic, trends that we have been observing in the region before have just continued, and I would say have even deteriorated. When it comes to the reforms, reforms have been going even slower, or in some cases have been reversing. We have seen that the states, what they did was that they've introduced strict measures, prevention of people to move, not allowing people to meet, introducing curfews, etc., etc. We have seen that the democratic institutions, such as parliament, have basically in some areas have ceased to operate. We have seen that the economic gap between the region and the EU has widened even further, that the economic gap inside the countries in the Western Balkans have been becoming bigger. Let's put it like that. We've seen that the education is suffering quite a lot. Possibility to switch to online learning, to TV learning has been difficult in many parts of the Western Balkans, which will even further deteriorate the quality of education, which according to the OECD PISA studies, for example, already was even pre-pandemic time showing a very bad results compared to rest of the European continent. Another problem, of course, is mobility. So far, it still remains very difficult to leave the Western Balkans and to move towards the EU, except with some exceptions. Basically, travel to the EU has been halted. The trade has continued to some extent, but the trade, again, because of everything, has slowed down, which means that also states have less money to spend. It means that the development programs, if there were any, needed to be reconsidered and decided differently. So the trends, negative trends, or status quo trends that we have seen before the pandemic, they either continued or deteriorated. What I see as an opportunities, and that would be my last points in this introductory remarks, is basically that the entire region is going through several parallel traumas. If you think about the health system, despite somewhat okay reaction to the situation, is going through the huge trauma, already lacking resources, human and financial and other resources will be even cut even more. People are going through the trauma. Economy is going through its own trauma. A lot of experts has been redirected. A lot of spendings inside the country. So on every level, in every portion of the society, there is some kind of a trauma, and there is potential to use it to redirect the focus of the Western Balkan societies towards developing viable and good public policies, be it health policy, be it social policy, be it tourism policy, agriculture policy. All these policies have been neglected before the pandemic and have not been seen and looked at as a potential for development. So the opportunity is the trauma. The other opportunity is the EU's re-engagement on the issues such as digitalization, such as green agenda, environmental issues in the region, and of course bringing the chain of production closer to the EU. And that is where the Western Balkans could see their chance to step in with parts of a necessary production, and then seeing potentially also a bit of economic development. With that, I would like to stop and open for further questions. As said, I've tried to summarize it in 10 minutes, so a lot of things have been left out. So feel free to challenge some of the things and to open a discussion. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Adnan. Before we move on, could I just ask, is there anything that's interesting to add about Croatia or Slovenia, since those weren't in the tables?
I think that when it comes to Croatia and Slovenia, from my perspective, you can obviously see that both countries went through EU accession process and have been addressing their institutions in a way that they've strengthened. Their research institute, for example, which is a virology institute in Zagreb, was involved on a daily basis with the EU research facilities, with exchanging information, etc. So Croatia, although it was under, let's say, bigger pressure than other countries because it's more integrated with Italy and with the EU at the beginning, it also had institutions, it had procedures that reacted. Furthermore, Croatian government, to a great extent, did not go into lockdowns, did not go into too much of shrinking shrinking private space or shrinking liberties as much as and as harsh as the Western Balkans states have. So in that sense, you could, at least from my point of view, you could see in all aspects, from education to economy and health reaction, you could see that Croatia has more stable, more organized, and better reformed institutions.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, let's continue with presentations. And now that you've got an overview, let's move to particularly the question of consequences and effects. So I will now turn the platform over to Chelsi West Ohueri. Chelsi, thanks again very, very much for agreeing to join us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me so much. Good morning, Mirman Jace from Austin, Texas. So I think for most of you, it's evening time. So I'm very glad to be able to join you. I'm going to share some slides with you all to just kind of guide my remarks. And if you give me 1 second, I need to make sure I've aligned my slides here. Okay. Okay. So I wanted to talk a bit today with you all about COVID in the Balkans, thinking about illness and inequality. My areas of study focus on racialization and belonging in the Balkans, particularly in Albania mostly, and looking at forms of structural inequality. And in my ethnographic research, so primarily I'm an ethnographer, I'm an anthropologist, I do a lot of work around how race is defined in a global context and thinking about processes of racialization. And because of that, I end up doing quite a bit of work too around how inequality is created and maintained, and looking at the social cultural factors that shape inequality throughout the region. And so what I'm going to be sharing today is focusing quite a bit on the impact of COVID and COVID lockdowns. Excuse me, sorry about that. Okay, so Albania's COVID lockdown for the spring of 2020, this began in March. And so especially with the heightened numbers of cases, hospitalizations, and death in Italy, and the close proximity between Albania and Italy, and the regular travel between the two countries, in addition to grounding flights and travel in and out of Albania, beginning in March, there were mandatory curfews issued where people were only allowed outside of their homes for so many hours during the day. And then supermarkets, banks, and other essential services were only open from 5 until 1 or 1300 during the day. During the week, rather, as well. And then there was a strict at-home mandate for pensioners. So people over a certain age were mandated to stay home, with the exception being for medical services. And then in April, there was an even tighter policy, an even more strict policy, which allowed only one person per household outside of the home. And this required an approved permission. And there were fines and potential jail time for violators. And during this time too, it's important to note that there was one of the reasons, or one of the justifications that was given for such a strict policy, was due to the number of ventilators in the country. Albania is a relatively small country, and at that time had so many hundreds of ventilators throughout the country. And there was a particular issues in areas outside of Tirana and central Albania and more rural areas. Also too, it's important to note that that during this time, there absolutely, so I'll go to my next slide here. The lockdowns, though, were tied to other issues and problems, particularly with work and hunger. And so especially as it relates to Roma, for example, and those who are engaged in more informal work, there was a major problem, because while the government did provide a certain amount of subsidies, in particular through companies and formal work businesses and industries, about 90% of the Roma and Egyptian populations in Albania are technically fall into the category of unemployed. Now, many of those in this category of unemployed do a lot of informal work, whether that's through material collections, trash collections, gatherings of items from places like riverbanks and reselling them, different types of informal trade. And then, of course, there's also practices like street begging. So these have been practices that have been ongoing in Albania for quite some time, as well as other countries in the Balkans. This was not new during COVID, but what happened is that when policies were put into place to give people money because of the impacts of the lockdowns, many of those in these informal sectors did not have a way of making money, right? And so there were fines, for example, and penalties for people being in the street. But of course, and I talk about this in my work as well, the rug, or the road, is one of the primary ways that many Roman Egyptians, especially in larger cities, get money and get money to be able to provide for their families. Food insecurity was a broad problem throughout that was highlighted across the globe from the moment that many nation states began to do these formal lockdowns, especially the more intense lockdowns. The UN and other organizations, also the World Bank, for example, began to sound the alarm about the impact of lockdowns in terms of hunger and food insecurity and food distribution. And so while in April, I actually collaborated with a couple of local organizations in Tirana as we tried to fundraise to get money for many Roma families in the Tirana and central Albania areas to get to buy food and necessary items for families who were struggling with food. And a lot of the attention, the global attention about this issue, has focused on countries like India. But in fact, certain organizations such as the European Roma Rights Commission and others have highlighted that there's not enough attention being paid to this issue of food insecurity and the impact of COVID broadly in terms of being able to feed families and provide families for Roma. So there's much more attention that needs to happen, especially across Central and Eastern Europe. And then there's a question of housing. And so the research that I've done primarily in Tirana has been with in informal camps and neighborhoods that are made up of Roma and Egyptian families. Now, in the wake of urban renewal projects, increasingly a lot of these camps have been destroyed. Many Roma and Egyptians have been relocated to these temporary resettlements, but there's a question around the temporality there and how temporary these resettlements are. And so many people are often trapped in these living and housing situations that were designed to be temporary, but in fact, this is where they are at the moment. These situations, though, those also also along with many of the standard living situations for many Roma in Albania are often inadequate and often involve people living in very close proximity to one another. And there's a lack of access to things like clean water, to plumbing and sanitation. And so all of these issues are further exacerbated both by the presence of the virus itself, as well as the lockdown and the response to it. So at the current moment, the lockdowns in Albania have since lifted. The strict lockdown was lifted earlier in the summer, but there's a question now of what measures might be taken as the numbers increase. So there was already a good amount, or not a good amount, there was an increasing trend in more scholarship on Romani health and inequalities in the Balkans. So there absolutely is not enough scholarship or research in this area, but over the past 8 years, and in particular over the last 3 to 4 years, there has been more attention to the lack of research. And I myself am including one of my recent publications here as well, but really thinking about the relationship between racism and discrimination and health outcomes. And so I wanted to share this because what we are seeing now with the COVID outbreak is that COVID is disproportionately impacting communities such as Roma and Egyptians in the Balkans, but we also already know that these inequalities were present. And that's why I'm sharing these examples. It's just that COVID is laying bare and exacerbating some of the health inequalities and inequities that were already ongoing, particularly in areas around reproductive health, right, and women's health, but also in broader questions around healthcare access, around housing, around transportation, around affordability and health insurance and coverage. Then there's also the question of anti-Roma racism during the pandemic. And so this piece was released in April, and I'm happy to provide the link to the longer, this is just an image from part of the piece. I'm happy to provide the link to the longer publication that was put out about the various ways that that racism and stigmatization and marginalization were further exacerbated due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is not actually even unique just to the Western Balkans or to the Balkan region, right? We see this going on throughout the globe. And so in my research, one of the questions that I ask is about this category of Blackness, because many Roma and Egyptians in Albania identify with the language of Blackness, or they see their situation in Albania akin to, for example, Black Americans, as an example, right? And so one question that had already been going on quite a bit in the US in particular were the ways that these racial logics, these racial falsehoods were amplified during the COVID pandemic, such that there were ideas about certain racial groups, including Black folks, but also if you look at Asian Americans, for example, being responsible for further spreading COVID-19. We see similar things happening in the Balkans. Particularly, this was an issue in Romania early on. The idea that and so it was not a new idea around thinking about disease and illness and disease being located in certain racialized bodies, right? So in this case, Roma, that was not a new idea, but these kinds of racial logics and these kinds of falsehoods were further exacerbated, further embedded as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition, though, at the same time, you also had many mistruths and ideas about Roma being immune to the COVID-19, to the virus. And that's also, again, that we have seen that same type of language in other places across the globe. And then also the ideas around biological notions of race, right? So we see these very biologized forms emerging once again, not thinking about race in terms of a social political category, but rather people amplifying. And this is when I say people too, I'm thinking about broader society, but also even in the medical and public health realms, because we did in certain parts of the Balkans saw higher rates of COVID-19 in Roma populations. Many ideas, again, emerged from these ideas of scientific racism, thinking that something was different about Roma bodies and relative to the broader population. And again, this is not unlike the same type of racial logics we've seen forming in parts of the West, where, for example, in the U.S., Latino or Hispanic Americans were thought to have something biologically different with them relative to white folks, for example. And same thing with Black Americans. And so this is very relevant and key because it definitely shows us more about how racialization is operating at these broader structural levels, but also too, it really is revealing the ways that certain vulnerable populations who were already experiencing greater forms of inequality are also more vulnerable to the virus, to the disease itself, and usually are exposed more, but those issues are masked behind these racial logics that are shaped by biological notions of race. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. So I'll start to wrap up here. I just wanted to, I have 2 more slides here. Just wanted to also draw attention to some other things that are going on. And so this article here that's in the middle is actually a very recent piece from Albania. In fact, that this is from yesterday, so make sure to check the date, it was yesterday. But that there is increasing chaos in Albania right now because many people, due to the COVID pandemic, are trying to secure oxygen tanks or cylinders from welding sites. And trying, people are trying to find ways to get access to oxygen and materials because there is already a shortage, but also a lot of people are getting more fearful about the pandemic and being able to care for them for themselves and for their family. So that is an issue going on. Earlier in November, we also saw a piece come out from Balkan Insight looking at conspiracy theories and how they are growing increasingly in Albania. And this is also the case in other parts of the Balkans. So I would look forward to discussing that as well, and how we see, again, another global trend, right? But thinking about the unique local and historical context for certain conspiracy theories. And then also this point here, another story that was from Balkan Insight, highlighted what was going on in Albania with thinking about aid from the government and how, and this is actually really tied to more of the current social political landscape in Albania right now too, because again, COVID is just drawing attention to some of the issues that were already ongoing. And so many of the conversations around aid and corruption and the and thinking about the disparities, economic disparities in the country. COVID is just drawing further attention there. And I'll conclude with this last slide here. I'm actually teaching a course right now on health, illness, and inequality, global health, illness, and inequality. And I think that what's been really interesting too is thinking about the broad worldwide movements right now, global movements against racism, right? What in some ways was really a response to, or really triggered by the death of George Floyd in the US. And we've seen a lots of responses to this, particularly in the Balkans, right? And thinking about what it means to stand up against racism, but in the midst of a pandemic, right? And racism itself being framed as a pandemic. And I think there is a lot of room for discussion here about how this is understood in the Balkans, and really thinking about the experiences of Roma and Egyptians, and as it relates to racism, how often that there is discussion of discrimination, for example, or even thinking about some of these programs like the decade of Roma inclusion and tolerance, but really thinking about racism as, and I actually don't like this framing of as a pandemic. I can tell you why in the Q&A, but drawing attention to racism as an ongoing crisis, right? As something that's already shaping our everyday livelihoods, even if often invisible. And so that's where I'll stop right now, and I'm happy to go to Q&A. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thanks so much. There's really a lot to think and talk about there. And one of the things that I think really becomes apparent from this presentation is the way how, although a lot of people in the Balkans like to think that race is a question that doesn't exist for them, it's at a moment of crisis where you can really see that conditions that are related in the crisis come to be expressed in ways that project elements of them onto things like the bodies or appearances of people, or ideas about genetics, which is fascinating. What I would like to do, I do want to open the floor for questions and discussion. But before I do that, I would just like to, I believe, is Danilo Ćerimagić here? Danilo, are you here? Hi. I would just like, Danilo, would you be willing just to take a couple of minutes? Danilo Ćerimagić is the program director for the A11 initiative, which is an initiative based in Serbia concerned with promoting social and economic rights, that has come out with reports on some special challenges that are presented by the pandemic, and some possible approaches to them. I wonder, Danilo, would you be willing just to take a minute or two to tell us what people in civil society have been thinking and proposing?
Sure, thank you. Well, thank you for the panel, actually, and for this interest in the Balkans, I would say, during this time. What we've seen actually during the pandemic was that most vulnerable population was actually left behind, and no one was really responsible for any of the support for this population other than civil society organizations. So, for example, we had cases of Roma population and displaced population from Kosovo without any support from the state. Even the access to water was problematic for thousands of people during the first phase of the pandemic. In some cases, we even had to go to the European Court of Human Rights just to get access to water to displaced Roma population in Belgrade. And this was actually just most of the support was provided through humanitarian assistance from international organizations and civil society organizations, and the state was not really willing to deal with any of these problems. Immediately at the beginning of the crisis, we tried to get attention from the government to actually set up something we called third crisis headquarters that will deal specifically with vulnerable population, but this was definitely still actually without any response from the government. In the meantime, the measures for the recovery of the first wave were missing actually most vulnerable population, and most of those that are in need of additional support were left without any support. Even these 100 euros for every citizen older than 18 years old were actually missing those that are in most need of this kind of support, because there was many of people without personal documents, or actually people that were not informed about ways of applying for this €100 of this so-called Corona recovery money, where helicopter money was actually they were left without this kind of support. Also, at the end, just to kind of conclude, we think that with all these problems that are actually happening, and with still without any change in any kind of better way than we had before, actually any improvement in the understanding of the needs of most vulnerable population are not happening. We believe the situation is going to be even worse. Just last week, we managed to persuade the shelter for homeless population to open up their doors. So they were actually not working for 8 months. So homeless population was not able even to get any support from the authorities. These kind of examples are happening more and more, and we think that actually the problems will just grow in the future. And again, without radical change in other direction, we think that Roma, displaced population, people living in poverty, people engaged in informal economy, all those actually that are already invisible will just be in even worse situation.
Okay, thanks very much. And I think now we actually have quite a lot of time for discussion. So what I will ask people to do, you do have the chance to electronically raise a hand if you have a question with the button at the bottom of the screen, or if you prefer, what might be easier is you can simply open up the chat window with the chat icon on the bottom of the screen, and if you have a question that you want to pose to the panelists, you can type your question in the chat, or you can simply say, "I'd like to ask a question," and then I'll call on you. So, however you want to do that. I guess here's let me open with a question for the panelists, and that's this: that at least at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of talk, maybe there is less now, about how the crisis was changing people's relation to the state and toward one another, and sense of their responsibilities, the possibility that it was creating a new environment of solidarity. Do we see any of that happen in the region, or was this an early fascination that fizzled out? What do you think?
If I would start,
Yes.
I would say that the strongest institution in the region or throughout the region is still and will continue to be family. Across the board, in all the research, from what is the value that people in the Western Balkans find the most important to where do they go in times of needs, it's the family. So the family support network continues to be relevant, and it's not going to be less relevant. I think when it comes to the institutions, I think there were, in the initial period, there was this lockdown, there was this images from Italy, images from China to some extent, images from I would say even Iran at the beginning were coming down, and population in the Western Balkans have been educated, let's say, in the past 20 years that they are the worst in the world. First of all, that they are the center of the world, and then that they are the worst in the world. So obviously the fear and the expectation was that what you see in Italy, it will be double as worse or triple as worse in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Kosovo, or in Serbia. So in that initial period, I would say there was this impression of state is doing something. It's closing borders. People have sense. If you close the borders, virus will come less later on. All that proved to be, to some extent, not true. So there was this, but then across the region, what happened is when the leader, and there was a fear among leaders, both I would say in Serbia, but let me talk about Bosnia-Herzegovina. In Bosnia-Herzegovina, there was a fear that they don't have instruments as politicians to react to the crisis, and that it might be the end of their rule, the end of the generation, if the images from Italy happened time twice or time triple. So they were quite afraid and were conciliatory. They were reaching out to people. But as soon as they've seen that the initial figures and initial anticipations were not happening, I would say April, May, it was a surge of the things that they wanted to do. Corruption, public procurement in Serbia, linking themselves with China, ordering all these surveillance and other stuff and putting them in practice, and with the help of investigative journalism, and as Danilo said, with the help of the civil society, which really took over and is taking over an important segment of public life in the Western Balkans. And without them, everything would be grimmer and darker and worse. I think that the trust in the institutions, trust in politicians has decreased. I would say, at least when it comes to Bosnia and Herzegovina, in many areas of the country, we can see with the local elections on Sunday that most of the people who were in charge, most of the parties and politicians who were in charge for the crisis have been losing their positions and have been losing their seats. So I think we went through different stages. I think what is opportunity now is for politicians, for new political forces that will bring to light what I think Danilo rightfully pointed out, and I cannot emphasize that, the role of civil societies, those being left behind in our societies, no one being able to speak for them, and to then create the energy that will then work on building institutions that could not just protect us from the health crisis, but, as I think Chelsi was talking, protect us from the economic crisis that is, by many say, going to, in the Western Balkans, to be worse than the health crisis itself. So I would leave it there, I think.
Okay, thanks. And Chelsi?
Yes, those are great points. And I actually will just tag on to what Adnan was just saying about institutions and thinking about especially trust in politicians, which was already, even prior to COVID, decreasing in a lot of flux in Albania, which I'll speak to explicitly to Albania, but also even within the COVID crisis and the economic crisis, there were other issues that emerged, including, for example, the response and the decision to demolish the National Theater in Albania, which there was quite a bit of resistance to, and then the way that it took place in the midst of a crisis that was already ongoing, and then as well as issues with education and financing of higher education, and then as well as a movement against sexual assault and sexual harassment led by many youth and younger women. And so I think all of those things were ongoing as well. And so against this broader backdrop of COVID. And so I think that must be taken into consideration when we think about people's relationship to the state and relationship to politicians and trust in politicians. I also think there was a really good point made about both the family and civil society in the individuals that I worked with primarily, and the civil society organizations. They absolutely felt that it was upon them to care for those left behind, as Danilo said, and felt that there was an intense urgency to do so already before COVID, but that intensity grew because they immediately realized, as they articulated, that no one else was going to be able to do it if they did not find ways to build solidarity and care for one another. And so I've seen a lot of that language increasing as we think as now this second wave, or whichever way we want to refer to COVID, is happening and taking place as well. And that language is very present, that discourse about needing to care for people, and who is going to care in absence of the state.
Okay, thanks. These are, yeah, very important points, especially if we keep in mind, I mean, probably this is not something unique in the Balkans, that this pandemic took place against a backdrop of relations between institutions and the public that were already damaged. So we have 4 people who have said they want to make interventions. Should we perhaps take all 4 and then go back to the presenters again? Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, so let's begin with Luciana Lula. Hello, Luciana, how are you?
Hello, how are you, Professor? Nice to see you virtually. Hello all, and thank you for the nice presentations. I'm Luciana for Albania, and actually from Albania, and I have a comment, a short comment on Chelsi's input, and then a question, if that's allowed.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's true, all of what you included in the presentation, and I would only like to add that due to a recent research we've been doing with some colleagues on the engagement of civil society and media in Albania and how they managed to cope with the crisis, I cannot share many research findings because it's not finalized yet, but one of the key findings was that actually in terms of marginalized groups and especially rural communities, the pandemic was had a huge impact on the work of civil society sector in this regard because they couldn't reach their target groups. And many CSOs even replied that their immediate needs during the pandemic and lockdown was to how to transform their donor-funded projects into online solutions, which isn't that much in compliance to and responding to the needs of communities. So that's something that I was surprised, not as a finding, but to see that actually the scope of work of several organizations got directly affected. So yes, thank you for bringing that. And also at the second level, many people from those marginalized groups were also highly affected by the earthquake of November, which was like 6 months ago. And during COVID and lockdown, they most of them were even homeless. So that's another issue. And the local public administration was overloaded with already files of reconstruction. So other aspects of society were put on hold. So it's been quite an intense period for those people. And I think the biggest gap filler have been humanitarian organizations or people with that humanitarian scope. But thank you for bringing in that, because in this pandemic, as many are commenting in the chat box, are showing many existing problems of the democracy, state, and governance and everything, but of course. And my question with regard to Adnan's tables is actually, would the first graph change if the number of testing from the region would increase? Because I see that the testing is low, despite Serbia has high numbers of testing from the other countries of the region. But if the testing changed, would then the results of the first table bring the countries of the Western Balkans higher or lower? Maybe that affects also decision to opening borders or not. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And then let's go over, the next commenter is identified only as Neven, but on the camera looks very much like Neven Angelic.
Hi.
How are you?
Sorry, it wasn't me. Fine, thanks. It offered me you'll be identified as Neven. I didn't complain, so this is how I ended up there. Thank you all. Thank you very much for great presentations. And I want to share something with you. Basically, this my project that I'm working on now, and I want to check with you, offer to you some views that I came across, and I try to determine the state, power, and society. And the pandemic was ideal because it cut off the specific date across Europe, and I measured 45 states in Europe. And of course, Western Balkan states come, as we can all kind of expect, almost at the bottom, but not quite. The Azerbaijan, Belarus, Russia, Turkey, and Ukraine are below. And then there is our group of Western Balkan states. I call it as a kind of suppressed society. And then I measured state response during the pandemic. and I expected to find something, and basically I found nothing, because at the top, all right, Serbia comes on top, but shares the position with Georgia, where the society is in much better position than in Serbia with regards to the state power. And there is no rule really that we can specify certain kind of regime has produced this kind of response towards the pandemic. So this is something that I want to share, and perhaps hear comments from our panelists and from you, Eric, as well. And then I have a few questions. One is the two states in particular, Kosovo and Bosnia-Herzegovina. They are sovereign states, but the sovereignty is supervised. Did you come across any findings about international actors in the Western Balkans? Did they contribute to the state response? If the contribution was positive or negative, or they stayed away from it completely? So that would be one question. Another one is migrants. I insist to call them refugees, but somehow this is the term that is widespread and perhaps in some cases quite justified. But this is the issue, and I know that in Bosnia-Herzegovina it was on the agenda, and there is a rather confrontational response, and there was a murder yesterday in Sarajevo. But are other countries affected in a similar way? Could we actually measure the regime, the state response with regards to the treatment of migrants during the crisis in particular? Albania would be a very interesting case since you focused your research over there, but all other countries of Western Balkans as well. I have another two more questions quickly. Albania, at the beginning of the pandemic, sent medical experts, medical workers to Italy as a state aid. Great public diplomacy, perfect, yes. Was there a shortage of medical workers later on when the pandemic hit Albania? Did they come back? Did they receive some aid? All these kind of responses are of interest to me. And finally, medical equipment. Basically, great business opportunity for quite a few regimes. And I would be interested if you could share with us some of the examples. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Evan. And let's just get two more before we go to our panelists. Let's go first to Elvisa Drishti.
Hi, hello.
Hi.
I also wrote my question in the chat because I'm not that good in English, and I might try to mix the points. But otherwise, I was thinking about, thank you first for the presentation, very interesting, and also for the case of Albania. I live and work here, so everything that you said resonated with me. But I would stratify all the effects of the COVID in the Balkans in three levels: individual level, macroeconomic level, and also institutions. And institutions also include the most problematic part. At the individual level, we have seen or witnessed more people who have a lower level of perceived life satisfaction or quality of life, and this is translated to a higher intention to emigrate, more people applying for the American and Canadian lottery to leave the country, more people emigrating illegally if they find a way, or trying to make the papers ready when the road is open. And in terms of the macroeconomic performance, these are issues that have been there forever, like poor labor market and macroeconomic performance, but they were even worse during the COVID. And also, as Luciana mentioned, the earthquake and also all these sequence of events that hit Albania as an isolated case. The issue of the institutions, that's the real deal in terms of explaining most of the problems, and which have resurfaced in the face of COVID. I mean, yes, to answer, I mean, when you said there is discrimination or ethnical ethnical problems in terms of the Roma in Albania, yes, they have been there. Many projects in paper exist to address this problem, to offer scholarships, but the effects are marginal or very, very small. They say they don't want to change, and they are also a victim usually used for political clientelism, because they have voting rights, they offer them homes and to fix them up, but they never do after the elections are over. So they also used in the, and we are approaching the government election in April. So yes, I mean, in terms of labor, in terms of institutions, this is just something that has put those into the spotlight, the case of the COVID. And the final point, the second wave of skills obsolescence following the collapse of the regime. Many teachers, for example, had to switch, elementary teachers who are of age had to switch to online teaching. And as the teaching system is worse as it is in Albania with the COVID, it went even worse. And not only the teacher, but also the students and families in rural area who don't have internet, don't have telephone or computers. They basically said that we attended school, but most of them just didn't. So yes, if these make sense anyway.
Yeah, that last point, I think, really underlines a lot of the solutions are based on the assumption that everybody has equal access to technology, which they don't. And let's go, can we go quickly to Will Bartlett and then return to the panelists? Will? You need to turn your microphone on.
Hello, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Yeah, two very interesting presentations and the comments and so on. Clearly there's huge issues around inequality within countries, and the Western Balkan countries are some of the most unequal countries in Europe, and the pandemic may, and the response to it may widen those inequalities. And I think you've given a good view to, a new view to us about the problems Roma people are facing, who are, a very marginalized group within all the societies. So, I mean, I think that's tremendously important. But my question is rather towards inequalities between countries, and in relation to Adnan's original data that he showed us. I mean, although on average, Western Balkans are pretty similar to EU countries in the effects of the pandemic, what was striking in your data was the very great differences between countries. So this sort of, with Montenegro being way up at the top and Albania, I think it was somewhere down at the bottom. And so that's, it's difficult to talk about the region having a uniform experience here. And I was just reflecting that, there's a lot of policy interest recently, or for a long time, but increasingly so, in regional cooperation. And there's recent Balkan summit gave rise to a declaration about creating a common regional market and integrating the economies and boosting regional cooperation. So what I'm wondering is, are there any actual signs of regional solidarity in regard to the pandemic effects? And, or on the other hand, do you think it's likely that the pandemic will undermine all these attempts at regional cooperation, because of through closed borders and all other sorts of inward-looking responses? So that's my question.
Okay, well, thanks very much. And can we maybe, Chelsi, would you like to go first?
Yes, sure. Thank you all so much for the questions and comments. And I wanted to respond to both something that Lutonia and Elvisa brought up, and that, yes, I failed to mention the fact that this, again, all emerged against the backdrop of the recovery from the November 2019 earthquake in Albania, which left pretty widespread destruction, and is an important factor because those humanitarian organizations and civil society organizations who would also be responsible for responding during the COVID pandemic were already overwhelmed by the response to the hurricane. And in fact, especially for those, the thousands of families lost their homes, there were already many rebuilding and restructuring efforts going on when COVID hit. And so this for sure has impacted the response. And also thank you, Luzonia, for sharing some of the preliminary findings from the research that you're a part of, because I actually had not engaged much with this question too, of not just the inability to serve communities because of all of the different factors, but what that means for how money is awarded from funders and the role that online or virtual or digital requirements, how that creates a challenge for actually getting the aid and funding to people. So thank you for sharing that. I guess, so going back, I was trying to take notes. I actually saw Elvisa's comment first in the chat. And so I took some notes to respond to that. And so I thank you very much for this framework for thinking about 3 levels. I did not mention or address migration, but your point there, your insight about intention to migrate and the ways that particularly out migration, so Albanians leaving Albania, right? And as well as migration internally in Albania are really important factors to consider. Albania's population is roughly 3 million people, but just over, or just at about 1 million live in Tirana. And if you think about the Duranis Duris, as a kind of a complex region, then over 1/3 of the population of the country lives in this area, right? So this is a very key point about the ways that pandemic and then the lockdowns as a response to the pandemic have altered the ability to migrate in the country and then out of the country. There's also been increasing issues at the Albanian-Greek border, which was already a particular space for geopolitical issues around borders, boundaries, and migration. But we've seen heightened attention there as shaped by the pandemic and as shaped by the economic effects of the lockdowns. Also, too, it's fairly common in many Roman Egyptian communities for people to regularly travel to places like Kosovo to do types of informal work, other places throughout the Balkans. And we've seen a lot of that change as a result of restrictions on travel and the pandemic as well. So thank you for bringing that point. And then also thinking about the relationship to institutions, and when politicians in particular pay attention when it's time to vote. I actually have a section in my book that I'm writing right now about this, because if you look at the neighborhood of Shkoz, which is just on the outside of Tirana, there was a lot of attention there, especially between 2012 and 2016. And many people felt that while there were changes that were made in the area, it was all to secure votes. And I think this is a big question that is really important for Albania, but also Albania becomes a way to discuss this matter that happens across the globe, right? So there's a particular type of salience, not just for Albania and the Balkans, but in this broader question of what does it mean to have structural change that is systemic and not just superficial award or superficial fixes to these very deeply rooted forms of inequality. And so you're absolutely right to think about that in terms of these levels. And then also, to the point about skill sets, yes, and teaching, right? So again, this is also not unique to the Balkans, but we see it in more pronounced ways, especially for people who don't have access to high-speed internet, who don't have access to computers or tablets or devices that allow students to engage in education. This is especially important too, because in many rural spaces, even where there might be fewer numbers of cases, right, because there's a smaller population, there's still some stringent forms of lockdown that close schools. And so there's a major problem there with being able to access the internet, to access education, or even accessing it in other forms like televisions throughout the region. But then also in cities, especially when you see a greater divide in income, that some families have more resources than others. And then, as Elvisa pointed out, there are many teachers who don't have training to deliver to practice their pedagogy in a way online. And so there's a big problem there. To take it back as well to thinking about Roman Egyptian populations, education was already a major area of focus in the Balkans, and the educational gaps that exist in Roma, Egyptian, Ashgali communities. And for sure, this is only much more pronounced as a result of the pandemic and the barriers to obtaining education. And I think that's just going over my notes here. So to some of the questions that Nevin asked to respond. So yes, Albania. So I would welcome someone else too, who might want to chime in and have more knowledge. I do remember the attention that was paid when Albania did send over a plane of healthcare providers, particularly nurses and doctors, in Italy. Those were temporary positions. So those individuals did not stay in Italy, but I'm actually not sure what the integration process was like when those providers were reintegrated back into Albania. I do know that a lot of the early concern, especially in April and May in Albania, was more about ventilators and healthcare equipment as it was about individuals. Of course, there were many hospitals and clinics that were already underfunded, and many individuals that were already overworked prior to the pandemic, right, in Albania. But a lot of the attention was on the lack of ventilators and the lack of therapeutics. And since the spring, you've seen donations from and gifts from countries like Germany. We've seen programs through the EU to increase supplies, to increase medical services. I'm sorry, to increase medical devices to Albania to prepare for this winter wave. And I think I'll stop there for now and let Adnan respond.
Okay, thanks very much. And Adnan?
Yes, let me start from the beginning. Question of number of tests, I fully agree. That's one of the main arguments that one could and should and must use. The issue is only that it's not just about getting more tests and doing more tests. The issue is more of a structural and resource point, in a sense of there are very few people across the Western Balkans that would like to get tested but cannot get tested because there is no place or time or resource to get tested. The issue here is that the tracking contacts is not being done maybe in the best way across the Western Balkans, so you actually do not have candidates for getting tested, that many candidates for getting tested. So I fully agree with that point. On what Will said on regional solidarity, I would actually praise Western Balkans in that sense, and in that way. First of all, if you live in Bosnia-Herzegovina today, and if you have citizenship of Bosnia-Herzegovina, places where you can freely travel are actually places in the Western Balkans region. You cannot go easily or freely to members of the EU. You need to fulfill certain conditions, and it's not just about having a PCR test or being, so they have kept open. So what we could rather see is that you have increased regional exchange due to the fact we've seen that in summer where people from Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina went more often to Albania for a seaside and other things. Green Lanes initiative to keep the customs open, to keep the trade flow between the region, inside the region, but also with the EU open, is, I think, a successful story. And there were instances of support in health-wise. Serbia providing support not just for Serbs in Bosnia-Herzegovina and in Kosovo, but also providing test kits for Kosovars, Albanians, at the point when there was a need for that. Obviously, cooperation between Kosovo, I would say, more, and Albania, and just a couple of weeks ago, there was a meeting between heads of states and government of Albania, North Macedonia, and Serbia, where they agreed that in border regions, there should be organized a way for people to get treated in the closest and the best hospital available. So you don't have to send from, I don't know, southern Serbia patients to Belgrade, but that you can actually treat them a bit closer. Whether that will be ever implemented and how in practice remains to be seen, but there is a political sphere on that. When it comes to the regional market and what they've agreed, I don't want to go into details, but I think that is part also of Nicoletta's question about the EU membership perspective for the Western Balkans. I think that at the moment, EU is ready to offer us support to open up not to create a single market in a sense that the EU is, because there you need institutions, rules, you need courts, etc. This is more to have a harmonized and more open six markets in the region. But as far as economic development and social development, bringing together poor economies can bring you only a little bit up. So what we need is to get attached to the EU, whether it's an EU membership or something that my think tank argues for, which it would be a membership in the EU single market as a first step towards the EU membership. On Neven's questions, examples of where now when you would say internationals, I think in case of Bosnia, you think OHR, EU for military mission, EU military mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I know only that the EU for planes were basically the only ones going to Bosnia at some point, initial point of the pandemic, from Vienna to Sarajevo for the EU for needs. And I know that they were also bringing equipment and some of the things that they needed. Of course, there is a huge EU support in a sense of paying for transfer of equipment from China, including Western Balkans in the procurement of medical equipment, etc., etc. So, but if you think about really instruments of international administration, then I can only remember. When it comes to the migrants in Bosnia and Herzegovina during the COVID, please, maybe we should talk one-on-one. The issue with Bosnia and Herzegovina compared to all other Western Balkan countries is that in Bosnia and Herzegovina, what Danilo mentioned, it's all up to non-governmental organizations. The state simply rejects, and state institutions simply rejects, except of the health system and municipal level to some extent, they simply reject to accept the idea that the migrants go through Bosnia and Herzegovina and that they need to be somehow accommodated. So the biggest problem in Bosnia and Herzegovina when it comes to migrants is this rejection not to get involved and to organize that temporary stay that migrants have. On examples of public procurement in Bosnia and Herzegovina, you had, and I think there again the role of independent investigative journalists is key, because they were the ones digging up the dirt about ventilators being bought in a way, basically a Raspberry company that was close to the prime minister got the job to buy the ventilators, and that is now being trialed in that sense. And I have yes, I think that's kind of from my side at the moment. I guess if I forgot something else.
Okay, thanks. And we have another question from Nicoletta Gashi, which Nicoletta, you've already put the question in the chat, but do you want to put it directly verbally to the panelists just for the sake of the recording?
Hi, Eric. Yes.
Yeah, thanks.
And I'm really sorry because I'm currently at work, so I'd prefer not to be on video. But yeah, as I've said in the comments, thanks so much to Chelsi and Adnan. I really enjoyed listening to your research, and both sides were presented in really interesting and different ways. But my question is really for anyone to take. I think Adnan touched on it briefly. So as I've said in the comments box, since today's research has predominantly focused on Albania, my question is related to these EU membership implications for Albania as a potential member state and as a result of these COVID-19 impacts. So looking at where Albania is in terms of its position as an EU member state, as we know, EU membership is arguably the country's biggest, or one of its biggest current political pursuits. So how does this new exposure to the poverty, these structural insufficiencies and problems that persist in local and national government bodies, the instability generally in the region, how will that affect the region in terms of its position as a potential? And is this COVID-19 pandemic really showing just how underprepared it is to become an EU state? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And I mean, maybe we can even add to that question. I mean, first of all, we can also say that the crisis has shown up some of the shortcomings of the states that are already EU member states, right? And another thing that we've been able to see, at least at the beginning, is the ways in which the pandemic was used to kind of explore alternative positioning for some of the states in the region. I mean, I'm thinking particularly of Serbia, giving a lot of publicity to assistance it had received from China, to this vaccine that had been approved for use in Russia, and for a short time they started trying to encourage its use there. So that is, in a way, the pandemic also became a site of competition for positioning, although that may not have lasted very long. And yes, but why don't we get your responses to Nicoletta? Whoever wants to begin.
I can begin.
Okay.
Thank you for that question. It's a very good question, Nicoletta. And I think too, I was actually revisiting a piece from Blindy Katsiu, who is who's a scholar in Albania, who was writing about Salih Berisha's first speech from 1991, and it could have been late 91, early 92. I'm trying to remember, but in his speech, kind of concluded with like, we are headed to Europe. We're going to be we're back in Europe, or something to that extent. And so I think a lot of this has been symbolized by EU membership, right? And it's been a lot of the primary focus. It's been very ongoing. And so I think this is a really good question to think about now in terms of the context of the pandemic and its response, and to what extent Albania's response and like you said, the exposure of these inequalities will affect it. And I actually have an answer that might be somewhat pessimistic, but I'm not sure it's going to affect it that much, because many of the stipulations or requirements were already what some anthropologists call check marks to begin with. And so these are very superficial things that needed to be addressed, so to speak. So for example, a focus on inclusion, which is very nebulous, as opposed to more focus on structural inequality that could be measured in actual wealth or accrual or property or food or jobs, right? That many of the requirements, especially as they relate explicitly to Roma and Egyptians, were already formatted in such a way that a candidate country could address or check the box without doing the necessary work, the structural work to make the change. And so I think because of that, even some of the things that COVID has drawn more attention to, I'm not sure how much weight those things would carry. And I think, to go to Eric's point, to see EU member states already struggling with these same issues, and one that's coming to mind is Romania, especially in its response to COVID and the experiences of Roma in Romania, highlight the fact that this kind of widespread inequality is already not being addressed within the EU. And so I'm not sure, but I also don't underestimate the ability for certain states, I'm thinking about France, for example, to use this response and to this more exposure of inequality as a means of not granting membership, right? So I see it, I could see it potentially going both ways. I also just wanted to draw attention to that, well, a lot of my research is focused, or at least my presentation today is focused quite a bit thinking about Roma and Egyptians especially, but that that poverty is pretty widespread throughout Albania, and we're talking about a country in which many people struggle to kind of maintain their income and well-being and food, and a higher quality of life. This is not unique to Roma and Egyptians, and I wanted to make sure I made that point as well, because in some ways, some of the heightened focus on issues like discrimination they're superficial, but they're also not comprehensive enough. So that some of these check marks and requirements aren't even taking into the total consideration of how widespread some of these forms of poverty are throughout the country, especially in more rural areas. And so again, I think that this question does illustrate as well what some of those fragments are. And I'm not sure how much these would weigh in terms of membership, but I'm also not as optimistic about how much these issues are going to be addressed and how they would be addressed, because the framing of them from the beginning is one that hasn't been comprehensive.
Okay, thanks very much. And Adnan, do you want to come in on this?
Maybe just shortly. I think, again, the situation in the Western Balkans, one needs to put into context with the EU. So if we speak about those left behind in Romania, if we speak about those left behind in the rest of the EU, I think we also need to take into account where the Western Balkans at the moment stand compared to that, and whether the instruments that Romania has at its disposal to be part of the single market, to be part of the EU, to have access to the EU funds, provided more opportunity to bounce back and maybe even go a bit up compared to the Western Balkans. And my conclusion is almost regularly comes to the point that it's better to be today Romania than to be in the Western Balkan countries, because the opportunities and the space is smaller in the Western Balkans. The issue that both Elvisa and I think Nicoletta mentioned is about the EU membership, and there I'm also, like Chelsi, skeptical in a sense that it will change that the EU will change its interest into enlarging. At the moment and for years, EU has not been interested to actively or proactively seek enlargement, to seek new members to join. On the other hand, many Western Balkan countries are also not in proactively seeking EU to enlarge to them, because leaders and are satisfied with the status quo. What's happening in North Macedonia, for example, and to some extent in Albania, is the test for both of the sides, because in North Macedonia we have government for several years, which is working on the reforms, which is doing what is expected to be done, but is constantly being pushed back by one or by more EU member states, showing that basically the attitude is we don't want you. So from my point of view, I think that the offer of EU supporting us to create a regional harmonized market to work a bit more in the region is a nice idea. It's a nice effort, but it will not be enough for us to have an opportunity which Romania will have and has today and will have in next couple of years as a member of the EU. So we need to look for more. And as a last point, if you look around Europe as a positive note, maybe, if you look around Europe from Belarus to Caucasus to Syria to Northern Africa, you will see regions in flame, I would say, in terrible conditions. And when you look at the Western Balkans, of course, there are tendencies, authoritarian tendencies, there are weak institutions, there are a lot of problems, but the Western Balkans have not been going back and using the empty space or the vacuum to go into wars or to go into some military actions or or to do things, which I think is both saying a nice thing about the Western Balkans, but also a nice thing about the EU, because in the Western Balkans there is still some who believe that at some point the process will go forward. And I think that the EU itself should not gamble that.
Okay, thanks very much. And let me say, this is about all of the time we have. But I think this has been a really super discussion. We covered a lot of ground, and I hope that there are people who, if you didn't get every question answered that you came in with, that at least it was provocative for many people. Let me just say there are some questions that and comments that we won't get to, but that are in the chat. So take a look at the chat before you leave. Let me give a tremendous word of gratitude to our panelists, Adnan Ćerimagić and Chelsi West Ohueri, to Danilo Ćurić for his for his intervention, to everybody who contributed questions and comments. And I'll just tell you, this is our last event that we have planned for this semester. We may still have unplanned events because the region is continuing to give us surprises. But failing that, our next events will be next term, and I cannot give you dates, but I can tell you what we'll have. We are going to have a panel on language and on issues around language that will be organized and moderated by our colleague Jelena Ćalić. We will have a conversation between Maria Todorova and our colleague Diana Georgescu, and we'll have a presentation on the literary history and the work of Ismail Kadare by Besa Hashani. So all of that will be next term, and I will have the timetable and announcements and summaries prepared for you sometime in December, most likely. So thank you everybody very much for coming. Thanks again to the presenters and all of the participants, and have a good evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Mir Papshim.
Well.